This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, this is CoronaCast, a podcast all about the coronavirus where we answer your questions. I'm health reporter Tegan Taylor.
And I'm physician and journalist Dr. Norman Swan. It's Wednesday, the 1st of April.
So Norman, you kept us on the edge of our seats. You told us yesterday that you had been tested for COVID-19. The results are back. What happened?
Well, the GP phoned me up and I was positive for another cold virus, but not the coronavirus. So I'm
what a relief.
COVID negative.
So I'm really curious because you've been obsessive about hand washing, general cleanliness, especially since this outbreak began. Every time we get on to record CoronaCast, I can hear you spritzing and washing and spraying and wiping. You still managed to get sick.
Yeah, because, what's interesting about most viruses is that most viruses are community spread. That's the norm. It's not necessarily the norm that you have to wait on somebody infecting you who's got off a plane from overseas, although that does happen. We just need to be reminded what happens every day of the week, every day of the year when we're not in a pandemic. And that's where you happen to pass somebody and pick it up in the air. You can pick up things quite easily, because COVID-19 isn't that common in the community yet in Australia. It's much more likely that you pick up another virus than COVID-19. And that's simply what happened to me. Goodness knows where I picked it up, but probably about, anywhere in the last couple of weeks. I might have been close to somebody in the supermarket. They coughed and I picked it up. I don't know.
It really reinforces the need for vigilance around COVID because, being sick isn't fun at the best of times, but COVID in particular can be really nasty to vulnerable people.
Well, that's right. And it's, almost certainly the virus that I've got is not as contagious as COVID, as SARS-CoV-2 is. Normally, these other viruses that are non-pandemic, the common cold viruses, probably there are not. The reproductive capacity is less than 2, whereas SARS-CoV-2 is between 2 and 3. So it's much more contagious. So that's why you're trying to keep it down to low levels, so that what you catch out there is what's common or garden rather than COVID-19.
And so we've got new stats on the growth rate falling again. The Health Minister, Greg Hunt, has said it's down at 9%, which is down from around 30% a week ago. So what's going on here?
Well, I think what's going on here is, increasingly it's good news. The measures that have been put in place, but really the behaviour change of the Australian community is having an effect. That by people avoiding going to work, avoiding mixing in large groups, staying at home as much as possible, hard though those things are, is making a difference.
Are we likely to see the trend continue downwards, or is it too early to tell?
Well, you'd hope that it would. I don't want to make any predictions here. I think, as we said yesterday, we've still to see the full effects of the Ruby Princess, which was a large cruise ship that came in, and there were other cruise ships that came in with inadequate testing and monitoring of people. And I don't think you've yet seen the full effects of those coming in. So you might see a bit of a Big Dipper happening where you see it kicking up again, which I suspect is why the government is being a bit leery about saying this is, we've won this battle. We'll only have won this battle when it really comes over the hump. We've really seen a peak and we're definitely on the downward track. And then the question is how fast we can get to very, very low levels of COVID-19, very low levels, and with a good testing regime in place, which means that we can start letting the foot off the brake. What a lot of people hope is that we could get there in between 4 and 6 weeks. And I suppose the government's messaging doesn't want to give people permission to get back out in the streets too soon, because that will just create a second wave and we'll be back where we started and it'll be really hard to find our way back from there. So really what you've got to do is maintain discipline, keep doing what we're doing, hard though it is, try and drive it down to low levels, and hope that we've set up the testing infrastructure which allows a testing regime, which means that if it suddenly pops up, or it pops up here and there, that we'll get right onto it, isolate, control, quarantine, and so we can get back to some semblance of normal life. But it won't be normal until there's a vaccine, because we're always going to have to be vigilant. Otherwise, this can come back with a vengeance.
Okay, so let's get on to some questions from our audience. Someone's asking, when people jog past you, panting and sweating and gross, are they putting you at significant risk?
Well, I suppose if they invade your personal space just as they're, flicking, whatever secretions they've got. So I'm not sure whether, for example, I don't think they haven't found coronavirus in breast milk. They have found it in stool, and I'm not sure whether they found it in sweat. But, sweat isn't the only secretion that you emit when you're in physical extremis jogging down the road. So I think you have to assume that as you're breathing up and breathing fast, if you've got virus there, you're more likely to be aerosolizing it. So if it was me, and in fact, it's interesting you asked that question, because when I'm out running, I steer clear of other people, and I certainly steer clear of runners coming towards me, because the sense is that with that bigger tidal volume, that bigger breathing, depth of breathing and rapid breathing, if they had COVID-19, if they had the SARS-CoV-2 virus, then they could actually be spraying it out a bit more than normal.
So can we talk about health workers? Why so many health workers seem to be falling sick with COVID-19 when they're wearing full protective equipment?
Well, I think the key here is that some health professionals around the world haven't been wearing PPE because it's not been available. And I think they're the ones who've been catching the disease. I think if you're wearing full PPE, I think the risk is pretty low.
What about government testing? So we've got a question asker asking, why isn't the government doing more testing in hotspots like the inner suburbs of Melbourne? She's living in a suburb of Melbourne. It's had multiple cases. She's had classic symptoms for 2 weeks, but she still doesn't meet the criteria for testing.
It's an interesting question, and I think it varies around Australia at the moment. What I do know in New South Wales is that in hotspots, GPs have been advised that they should be testing as many people as possible, and that they've changed the testing regime. So around Bondi Beach, where there's been a lot of cases, I think GPs have been told the gloves are off, get going with testing, because there's so much around that they want to find out everybody who's there and really get it under control. And it recognises what we've been saying for a long time on the Coronacast, is you can really only get this under serious control by extending your testing regime. We've got to move beyond just testing people who have come back from overseas or have contact with somebody with COVID-19. You've got to actually start testing everybody with symptoms. And so that's what they're doing in New South Wales. And I suspect, and the new rules allow GPs to have some degree of authority here. And so for the person who's written in from Melbourne, the GP is free to do her testing if the GP feels it's necessary, and doesn't have to stick to the absolute rules. And the rules do allow, very specifically nationally, for clusters and areas with high prevalence to ramp up testing. So I think that she needs to ask questions of her GP, because she might well find out that, in fact, GPs are allowed to do far more testing than they think.
Well, that's sort of how you managed to get tested, isn't it? Your GP was able to exercise that discretion.
Yeah, and I actually live in that area in New South Wales, which has got a high prevalence. Yep, that's exactly why.
So, to you, our listeners, we want to ask you a favour. We want to make an episode of Coronacast next week that's all about busting myths that are circulating on social media. If you're seeing the same type of messages popping up in your email or on WhatsApp or group chats or Facebook or Twitter, send it to us. Our email is coronacast@abc.net.au. Forward us those emails, send us screenshots. We'll collect them all, we'll show them to Norman, and he'll debunk them for us all. Our email again, coronacast@abc.net.au.
And maybe one or two of them aren't myths at all, and maybe they actually have something to it, that turning around in a circle and eating a ton of mung beans is good for your coronavirus.
Exactly. And Norman, you're going to tell us all the truth next week.
I hope so.
Bust some myths. Okay, so with the talk about school closures and kids washing hands, there's been a lot of talk about kids around COVID-19, but a new preprint study is saying that perhaps kids are less of a factor in transmission than we thought.
So this is important research, but it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, so we've just got to be a little bit careful about it. But what they did was they looked at the available data of the spread of SARS-CoV-2 and where it came from. And what they found, just very briefly, was that about 10% of the spread came from children. In other words, that the child could be identified as the first case. And if you compare that to the flu, bird flu, and most cases of flu where we have problem outbreaks, children are actually the first case half of the time, which is why in a flu pandemic, one of the first things you do is shut down schools. And in this pandemic, they've been having 5 bob each way on whether you shut schools or not. It's not that children don't get infected, they do. It's just that they don't seem to be high transmitters. So in flu, they are spreaders, but they don't seem to be spreaders here. The spreaders may well be the 20 to 29-year-old age group in SARS-CoV-2. And if you look at South Korea, there's a big peak in that 20 to 29-year age group. So it's not so young children are less spreaders, but it's still 10% than if it was the flu.
Well, that's it for CoronaCast today. You can send in your questions by heading to abc.net.au/coronavirus or find a link from the CoronaCast website.
And if you haven't already, please tell your friends and family about CoronaCast. They can find it on the ABC Listen app, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they get their podcasts. We're just simply everywhere.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.